In the writings of Plato, specifically his Timaeus and Critias dialogues, we are regaled with the story of one of his ancestors, Solon, who made his way to Egypt in the 6th century BC. While there, he conversed with Egyptian priests who spoke of another era, 9,000 years before then, when Athens defended the world from a mighty empire that hailed from the continent of Atlantis. Atlantis was a mighty country and ruled with an iron fist, but their arrogance and pride caused Zeus himself to strike them down for their wickedness, and the entire continent sunk beneath the waves and the people on it forever lost to the sea, save for those rare survivors intermingling with tribes beyond their native, but now forever lost country. But was this story true? A fabrication of Egyptian priests seeing a gullible listener? A misunderstanding of Plato's personal philosophies? Or something else? Here we have one of the most compelling mysteries of history and mythology in the destruction and disappearance of an entire continent in the span of a day, if it ever existed at all, which we'll be discussing tonight on Friday Night Frights. I'm your host, Christian Ashley of Systematic Geekology, here to terrify and instruct you all on the weird, unusual, fascinating, fantastical, and unexplainable things that may or may not lurk out there in the world. Just as a reminder, our schedule is to, once a month, cover one of 6 categories. This would be the cryptozoology, the paranormal, religious strangeness, the weird and the unexplained, which we're on right now. Then we have true crime, and finally, we end in December with ufology. So, obviously, we're in the weird and the unexplained. Now, why is Atlantis here? Well, the weird and the unexplained, as a category, is kind of a catch-all term I've used for the things that don't necessarily fit with the other 5 categories, but there might be some crossover, but they're their own thing. Like there are plenty of things out there in the world that could inhabit the weird and unexplained. And we'll get into more of those as time goes on. Now, as for Atlantis itself, does it exist? Well, before we get there, we need to hit some points of clarification. It is whew, all the research I've done on this and all the years I spent on before this, I knew this was going to happen, and I still don't know why I'm surprised. Everyone who has written a book about Atlantis, whether they're a skeptic, whether they're a believer, they are incredibly biased in their findings and what they pick and choose of what they choose to believe. Like, look, it's very easy to see why they rely on some confirmation bias to uphold their beliefs and disregard anything that contradicts that point of view. So I've chosen a select few who all hold various biases within them, and I haven't yet read a book that was constructed well enough to show all points of view well. If such a book exists and I just was dumb enough to not find it, please feel free to leave a comment so I can add that to my collection. I would love to see what someone else would have to say that takes all these different hypotheses and theories and then actually takes them seriously. And even if they have a personal one they like, gave them all their due credit. So, another thing, unfortunately, we do have to mention here for Atlantis, and there's really no way of going around this one. It's very annoying. We need to be extremely careful when talking about some of the people who believe in Atlantis and the theories that they throw out. Many early Atlantis theorists came from a very different time, and their idea of what is acceptable to believe and say do not correlate well with the gospel or our modern sensibilities. There are unfortunately many people today who believe in Atlantis who will likewise harp on those older ideas and believe in the many radical and very racist, let me put emphasis there, ideas. They say that it is impossible for some people groups in the world to make the structures that they have. You know, the Mayans and the Aztecs never could have made those pyramids. You know, the Egyptians couldn't have made it because, well, or they couldn't have had the scientific knowledge that they had because they just didn't have some smarter, whiter race out there teaching them how to get things done. So when you look into certain Atlantis theories, that is a path you can go down on. I would suggest reading it in the context of the times, then moving past it. And this itself, these theories too, come very dangerously close to some racist implications that not all ancient alien theorists do, but a surprising amount do. In that, oh well, these ancient cultures were too stupid to be able to develop anything, so there had to be an alien race who came and allowed them to be able to get on this path of progress. Is that what we're discussing tonight? If this is something that you yourself hold on to, you just happen to head to this YouTube channel, you saw Atlantis here, and like, oh, maybe he's going to talk about my pet project here. I would ask you to question why you think things had to happen that way in your opinion, and then realize that it is not a path you are best spending time on. And look, I am open to the idea of hearing of ancient civilizations uplifting the people around them, or at least entertaining the idea, but not if the real goal and the end goal is to demean certain people groups. So that's our PSA there. Now, for the rest of the purposes of this discussion, I will be focusing on Atlantis as a real physical location, as well touching on it possibly just being used as an illustration. And in order to get through all that, we have to go through some important figures, just not everyone who's tied with the mythology of Atlantis, but like just to select three. And in my opinion, crackpots all in their very different ways, but I would be very remiss not to mention them. So first up is our boy here, Ignatius Donnelly. Now, his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian Age World, which one was it? It's, oh gosh, I should know this. I read the book. Whichever one it was actually one I used as a source. And it's one of the oldest books we do have on Atlantis. He was originally a senator from Minnesota, and he became enthralled with the idea of Atlantis, wrote on it, and believed that Atlantis existed before the flood, and certain people groups could trace their ancestry to it. Now, once again, here's the unfortunate part, and not wholly unexpected part of this point in history. This is based on several racist ideas at a time, including Mayanism, which some proponents of it believe that the Maya people group of Mexico and Central America were descended from Atlantean citizens, thus proving that their technological and scientific achievements could only come from being descended from more European-esque stock. Now, not all modern believers in Mayanism think this, and in and of itself, it's more of like a blanket term, kind of like how New Age is kind of like a blanket term for a lot of very different ideas. They just kind of place this special emphasis on the Mayan people, but this is how he primarily meant it. So that's good old Ignatius. Then we have one of my least favorite people who's ever existed, Helena Blavatsky. She is a mystic and philosopher who, and also one of the founders of the, not religion, but also totally occult theosophy, which I'm not going to go into great detail for time's sake, but for the sake of brevity, consider it one of many spiritualist ideas started in the late 19th century that combine the beliefs of many different religions and ideas to try to help people understand the world around them. That is a very charitable way of talking about it, but here we are. Blavatsky continues our very racist theme in the belief that Atlantis was home to what their group kind of called the fourth root race. There's a lot going on there. We don't have time to discuss it. Now, theosophy itself is something I would like to discuss on the show. Eventually down the road, I might put that in religious strangeness, but it's a wild ride. I got to be in the mood for it too, because there's time you just want, I can't handle this. This is just bad. But her idea is this fourth root race from Atlantis are where all intelligent white people are descended from following a shift in the earth that caused the destruction of Atlantis. I'm sure that a lot of people like, I was not expecting this much racism within my talk about Atlantis. Well, I'm sorry to be the one to do that to you, but this is how things go. Next up, we have good old Edgar Cayce. Now, Cayce is someone I find fascinating as a figure. Definitely someone we could do an entire episode on as well. And he grew up in Kentucky in a Christian family. He is known as a Christian mystic who claimed to have various visions of not only his past lives, so he did believe in reincarnation, but also the lives of others, some of whom, like him, were tied to the continent of Atlantis before it fell. He made a prophecy before his death in 1945 where Atlantis would rise above the waves in 1968, which ties into one of our possible locations for Atlantis. So that's just three people. There are plenty more I could have discussed. Like I did use other authors for sources. But just to give you a general sense of some people who are very interested in this concept and some of their wacky ideas along the way. So, what does this bring us? Where is Atlantis? Where can we find it? Well, your guess is as good as mine. But we're going to go through a couple possibilities. Not all of them, once again, for the sake of time and for the sake of my voice and all that mess. But we're going to start with Thera slash Santorini. Now, my eagle-eyed viewers out there, you go, that's a screenshot. Indeed, it is. That is from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, where you can find spoilers Atlantis in the game. So, at this point in history, around 1600 BC, on the Minoan island of Thera, Minoans were people who lived primarily on the island of Crete. They had their own civilization. They spread out to what we would consider part of the Greek world. They really established themselves before the Mycenaean and Greek culture did. So, like I said, there is also known as Santorini, and there just happened to be a massive volcanic eruption there, which destroyed the city of Akrotiri, which was a Minoan trading city. And much like the disaster that would happen to Pompeii many centuries later, its eruption basically wiped the entire city out. We don't have, I don't think, as much evidence as we do for like Pompeii, considering it happened even further in the past. But it caused immense devastation to the point it is speculated to have been the cause of a volcanic winter that is reported on in the annals of Egypt and the Shang dynasty around this period in time, due to the sky turning yellow and crops failing, which would be a sign of a volcanic winter. That is something, there's just enough soot and ash and dust in the air that it affects, the sun's ability to bring light to crops and stuff like that, and makes things a little colder. In fact, one of the more infamous things that ever happened due to the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 is the year without a summer in 1816, which once again just happened because there was just so much volcanic ash and dust in the air that it just ruined crops. And in fact, the temperatures recorded for that area are very low. So people think this is something that might have happened there. Now, why Atlantis? Why do people think Thera is where it's located at? Well, there are several things. Once again, the Minoans were kind of renowned in the ancient world for their military might, for their trade and industry, and their technological achievements, like their metalworking, their plumbing, that far exceeded the achievements of their neighbors. Now, what does that sound like? Well, it sounds like the Atlanteans, in that sense of they were stronger, more militarily strong, more economically strong, more technologically strong. So maybe a little bit of, shall we say, envy from those talking about them. Now, even naturally, like, given that they were primarily in Crete, the Minoans were rivals of early Greek culture, even at this point in history. But perhaps, perhaps it would be best said that this was very one-sided on the Grecian front. They wanted to be seen as rivals, but clearly there was a winner here. And the fall of Thera is one of those things, Antokiri, that caused, some people believe, Akrotiri, not Antokiri, but Akrotiri, that caused the fall of the Minoan civilization. Because what it did is it damaged their ability to trade. Like, Akrotiri is one of their main ports there that they would use to deliver goods to the area. Like, the volcanic winter is speculated as being a cause of them, like being at the epicenter of it. Their crops were failing. They would have to have fled to find food. So that's one thing there. And we get into a very interesting, like, mythological and historical complex here for the Greek people. In that, if you know your Greek mythology, well, the Minoans are where we get the myth of the Minotaur from. And a big part of that story is showing just how much Greece was under the thrall of the Minoans, to the point where Theseus has to come in there and kill the Minotaur and eventually win some freedom for Greece. Now, this could definitely be a cultural story. This is how we won in the end. Or it's just like, man, we didn't get that fight we wanted, so we're going to say it's better than what actually happened. Or it just seems like the environmental changes just negatively affected Crete and the Minoan civilization too much. And they were basically no longer a powerhouse in the region. Now, counterpoints to all this. Remember our story from before. This doesn't fall in line with the 9,000 years where Atlantis and Athens were supposed to be at war. This is easily countered by the fact that at that point in history, there aren't supposed to be any advanced nation states as we would understand them. And in fact, this would predate a very commonly held opinion within academia that Jericho is the world's first major settlement and city, and it was only established around 9000 BC. So this would have been almost 10,000 years. Uh, excuse me, no. Yeah, almost 10,000 years before Solon came to the Egyptian priests. So as far as record keeping goes, doesn't really work out. Once again, this isn't impossible for this to have happened. We just don't have the archaeological records. Like, there's plenty of history that's been lost to time because the people weren't literate, or if they did, the writing didn't survive. So it's possible, but highly implausible because we just haven't found the idea of this actually being something that could have happened. Now, if we assume that the 9,000 years distance between Solon and the Egyptian priests is artistic license, or a record that accidentally got tainted over time and instead was meant to be 900 years ago instead of 9,000, then Thera makes more sense as a potential location of Atlantis. Athens as a city had only been populated since around 3000 BC and rose to prominence as a larger city-state around the decline of the Minoan civilization. So this too could point to there being a correlation to the destruction of Thera, as a means of Greeks taking that as a sign of the gods' favor. And then the story got corrupted over time to become the Atlantis myth. So, like, like all of these ideas, there's going to be pros and cons, and the Thera one makes enough sense. But given the descriptions of Atlantis being like outside the Pillars of Hercules in the original story told to Solon, like that doesn't make a lot of sense. But once again, it could be a corruption of history. Is like details were remembered wrong, things were written down poorly. Who knows? Next up on our docket, we have the Canary Islands. Now, these are nestled in the Atlantic Ocean, so these would be past the Pillars of Hercules, and they're very close to Africa. They have long been speculated to be the last regions of land to survive the cataclysmic destruction of Atlantis. If Atlantis were indeed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, then it is certainly possible that parts of the continent survived. So, points for some Atlantis researchers go and look at the unique culture and language of the Guanche people. I had to look that one up. I think I pronounced that correctly. Who they claim to be the last true surviving members of Atlantis. Their isolation and the location of the islands makes them, in these researchers' minds, a little easier to think of that idea. Counterpoints to this, however, which I do favor in this extent. The Guanche people do have genetic ties to the Berber nomadic people who you would typically see. North Africa is where they come from, so it is very easy to figure out that they migrated there from Africa and decided to stay. The journey to the islands by a ship from Africa would be easily done and was well within the technological achievements of the people at that time. Also, geological studies done at the islands shows that they, over a period of millions of years, have shown signs of slowly being uplifted from the sea in a manner consistent with research shown to other islands, and there appears to be no record that scientists have found of any significant appearances of anything so catastrophic as an entire continent sinking into the sea, at least where the geological record of the Canary Islands is concerned. That's not to say it's impossible. There could have been some continent in the middle of the Atlantic that we have because no one's really surveyed that as far as I am aware. But as far as the Canary Islands themselves being like the lone survivors of Atlantis, it just doesn't seem geologically possible. Next up, we have Bimini and the Bimini Road. This is one of my favorite things I've ever learned when it comes to this weird stuff for Atlantis. It's very fascinating to me. Like, is this possible? Could this actually be a thing? So, before I get ahead of myself again, in 1968, we had about 3 divers who discovered a large, seemingly man made rocky structures akin to a road that were under the sea off the island of North Bimini in the Bahamas. Now, recognizing that this could possibly be an archaeological site, attention was brought to it by them, and the region has been researched ever since as the Bimini Road. And what this essentially is, outside of this one photo here, there are what seem to be groupings of stone that look like they've been carved that go in directions as one would if you were building a road. So that's one of the reasons it's called that. Some people think it might be a wall or, oh gosh, what were some of the other ones? I can't remember off the top of my head, but the general sense is this seems to be man made. So, pros first. Some researchers who have explored this location have made the claims that this could not have been something that formed naturally, given the repetition of the same shapes as what appears to be stone carved into something fitting what we would think of as a road, and they follow a very distinct path. Now, unfortunately, one of the things that kind of ruins research into this is in 1923, a hurricane went by the island and did like some irrevocable damage to some of the site, not all of it, but a large part of it. So it's hard to see like, well, what was a result of the hurricane? What was a natural thing? From what I understand, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a stonesmith or what have you, or geologist. I'm just throwing that at you. So it did some damage to the point where it's very hard to see what you would have liked is like, could this just have been natural erosion or something like that? Now, to some proponents of Bimini being related to Atlantis, so well, you say, well, sure, there's a road there, Christian. What does this have to do with Atlantis? Well, let me help you out here. Remember our boy Edgar Cayce? He said before he died, in a supposed prophecy, that Atlantis would rise above the waves again in 1968. Now, this is a very liberal interpretation of said prophecy, but we can all see why they would latch on to this idea. It's like, well, of course, it didn't literally rise above the waves, but it did in the annals of history because people were talking about it above the water. And like, sure, I guess if you want to be that way about prophecy, I guess we could possibly say that. But Cayce is one of those people. He did make several prophecies. He had some very false ideas about reincarnation and how the church is supposed to work that makes me think he wasn't all there as much as I really would have liked him to. He's a very fascinating guy, but I don't think he was all there mentally by the end. And this is a very slim, flimsy, let's put it that way, flimsy way of interpreting this supposed prophecy. Now, counterpoints, besides what I've mentioned already, most critics of these hypotheses point out that this is simply pareidolia or apophenia, and because it looks like a road, then our minds simply make it so. We've talked about apophenia before. Pareidolia is that sense of the face on Mars is a big one. You know, as much as I first encountered that, and like all the way back, I remember seeing a commercial from something my dad had taped in like the 80s. It's like, is there a face on Mars? No, there's not. Unfortunately, in that from some of the pictures that were taken from one of the expeditions we sent out, there appeared to be, due to the shadows and the shape of this mountain on Mars or a hill or whatever it was, a giant stone face. And like it sparked people's conversations. Be like, oh, is it possible? Is there an ancient Martian civilization out there? But what it actually turned out to be is what is known as pareidolia, and that is our brain's ability to try and look at something and give it meaning. It's looking at that stump in the woods and thinking, oh, that looks like a finger, or oh, that looks like a face was carved in there, when it's just the natural way it happened. So this is something that's going to be thrown out against a lot of things. And it's a very valid criticism because that's what the brain does. We look for patterns. That's why I threw apophenia in there too. It's like we look for things to make sense. And if we see something, if we see the image of Jesus in our toast, we go, oh, there's a sign from God, instead of the fact that it's probably just how things ended up. And our brains want to do that. We want there to be more order and construction in reality, but it doesn't always work. So this is a criticism. It is not a good criticism, in my opinion, when you actually look at the entire Bimini Road, because if this is pareidolia or apophenia, this is some of the best crafted natural locations in the world. Like, it's not outside of the frame of possibility that God could have allowed this one particular region of the world to look like a road, but to only do it through natural erosion. Like, it's not impossible, but it's highly implausible to think that this could happen that way. It doesn't feel plausible. Now, as to whether or not this ties to Atlantis, that's where I get more skeptical. It's skeptical. And I think perhaps this was the working of the natives of the region, whose names I forgot to write down because I'm a hack. I think it starts with an L. And that over time, like the sand shifted, water rose, like it just unfortunately got lost. So that's where we're at. Next up, we have a pre flood civilization. And yes, that is an image from the movie Atlantis, the Lost Empire. This is of the belief that with the coming of the Great Flood, humanity was wiped out save for those in Noah's family who resided on the ark. As we look into Genesis, even before these events, we see that humanity was mired in decadence to the point where only one family sought after God. And thus God turned his back on humanity, cursed them, sent the flood, wiped them all out except for Noah's family. Now, several theorists believe that Atlantis exists in our mythology because the survivors of the flood carried stories of the evil empires of the world that God struck down for their sin when he flooded the world, and this eventually became the legend of Atlantis. This is one of the things Donnelly brings up. He's not the only one, even, God help me, even Blavatsky kind of brings up some of this stuff in her twisted way. So it's not implausible. It's plausible enough, but unfortunately it is dramatically hindered from being considered too seriously, and that we don't truly have any archaeological evidence that suggests there's something pre-flood. Or, I mean, obviously the entire world doesn't think there was a flood. So how does that all work out? Well, one counterpoint against that would be that plenty of cultures in the world, most cultures, and I think I was looking at this the other day, it's like a very small group of people, and it's only like recently, like kind of started cultures don't have a flood myth. And people will point out and say, oh, well, there's something that was just so terrible in the past of humanity that every single culture has this happened. This is why we're here. And everyone has their different interpretations of how it happened. Obviously, in scripture, we have the true story of Noah in that sense. But it's that shared sense of the Babylonians had this, the Polynesians have this, the Creek have this, or so on and so forth. And then they correlate the two ideas to include Atlantis in all of this. Now, I brought up Blavatsky. This is where she comes in a little bit more. And I'm sighing because I really don't like her. I really don't like her. But to give her side of things, to be as fair as I possibly can, being as biased as I am, this ties into one of the ideas in theosophy is that there was a global flood. And I think this is one of many causes that destroyed Atlantis, that there was earthquakes and stuff like that. And the fourth root race were almost totally wiped out because of this. And most hold to those ideas. They don't believe Noah necessarily. They believe in like multiple survivors who went out and then became the different, respectable, people groups of the world. And then there were other degenerates out there, and they were the other people who became the people who weren't as smart as the other ones. It's bad. It's real bad. I have no patience for that part of it. So, in their idea, instead of it just being Noah and his family, there were varied survivors who populated the earth in different continents, and they left behind what records they could of where they had come from before. There you go. That's her part. Now, a minor part of this that I find very fascinating is the what's the word I'm looking for here? The weirdness that is ooparts. Now, what are ooparts, Christian? Well, they are out of place artifacts. that have been dug up around the world in places where they shouldn't exist. These include things like, what appears to be spark plugs, what appears to be batteries, hammers, coins that originate from different periods of time and nationalities that shouldn't be where they're at. A Phoenician coin found in America, or like this hammer that was when they carbon dated, it's like from a time where humanity didn't have access to those tools, apparently. And proponents of the pre flood civilization theory point to this as proof that there was a civilization before the flood that reached to great technological heights far faster than us, and what we've discovered are remnants of their once mighty scientific pursuits. I do find myself going down this path a little bit sometimes when I'm thinking about if Atlantis was actually a thing. Because when you think about it, at this point in time, what we see in scripture is that humanity only had the one language. Babel hasn't happened yet. So, how much easier would it be as people if we all understood each other to work together, even in the midst of sin, to create something so great, to be far beyond where people think we were at that point in history? Like I said, certainly plausible. But not everyone agrees on what these objects are or their purpose. So I'm going to definitely be adding that episode topic for you all to vote on later on the subject of blue parts. It's something very fascinating because they're all over the place. Like we can do episodes on just like the like a Baghdad battery or something like that, or what you call it mechanism that's supposedly a Greek calculator. All fascinating stuff. So that's it for that. Then we go to Atlantis as a philosophical concept. I'm going to go back to our boy Plato here, looking pretty stony right there, I might say. And in his Republic, Plato kind of uses the example of Atlantis as a counter to his idealized desire to have Athens, excuse me, to have Athens be the way that human society should aspire to become. Like, it's one of those things. It's been a very long time since I've read Plato. So if I get anything wrong, I am open to correction. But like Athens, that's what he wants. That's his idealized state. Athens did not treat him very well, I might add. But he still like believed in the concept and the idealism of Athens being number one. So he contrasted the decadence of Atlantis' fall with the glories of Athenian democracy and morality to show that his city is far better than one that maintained a technological and military advantage over them. So some people think he just made that up. The whole story of Solon going to Egypt, just so he can have an illustration and say, oh, well, I appeal to authority. Like, Solon, he did all these great things. He was a great leader of the city. So you can trust what he has to say so that I can make my argument here. And you can see where the wheels are turning there in people's heads. So, do I think this is just Plato using the idea of Atlantis as something he made up to get his point across? It possible. Once again, it's possible. But given what we've found in these other regions of the world, that just seems to be maybe it's not called Atlantis. Maybe it's just a name that was passed on to the Greeks. There's something out there, something more that seems to be like all these connections between the Americas and Europe and Africa and Asia. It's like they just happen to have all these similarities. It's possible. Humans, I mean, the whole idea of people bring up pyramids all over the place, and that meant there had to be everyone in contact with each other was because pyramids are a really great, foundational step to make for some things. And that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about like artifacts that we find or different names and stuff like that. Like, once again, I wish we had more time to go over everything, but we can't. So, do I think this is just a philosophical idea he came up with? No. I think he's actually telling a story that he heard all these years after that his ancestor went there, and there's something they called Atlantis, is probably not its actual name, and it was out there. So where does this leave us all? Like, what are our final judgments on this? Well, there are plenty of plausible reasons to think that Atlantis at one point in time may have existed. However, without extensive studying, our likelihood of that ever being proven true is practically nil at this point in time. So, what do I myself believe? Like, I could have gone all over the place. I could have talked about the Atlas Mountains in Morocco and how that region is sometimes called the Atlas Islands and stuff like that because of like a cultural Berber tradition. I could have talked about how some people think it's Great Britain or Ireland or Greenland or the Americas itself. Like, what that does tell me is that there's so much here. There has to be something. And I lean towards the pre-flood civilization that advanced a little too swiftly for its own good, got decadent, fell, God got angry, wiped them out, and as a cultural retelling that got lost in translation over time, we now have Atlantis. That's probably, if I'm having my bullets up here, that's probably number one. Second up is probably the continent that disappeared, just happened to be in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, once again, that's one of those things that's very hard to prove. That's the unfortunate thing about a lot of this. It's very hard to prove all of this. But that's the one I lean to because there does seem to be that interconnection between the Americas and Europe and Africa of trade, of items that shouldn't be there. Well, where would they have done this at? By meeting in the middle. But once again, I'm not going to say, like, yeah, I'm taking a bullet for that one. And there are plenty of counterpoints against that argument, which I'm all for when we're discussing this thing that no one really knows the answer to. And in third, like, if I had to give another one, I would go with it's just an illustration used by Plato. As much as I don't want that to be true, it's a lot cooler, if Atlantis is real. But there we are. And with that, what do you believe, dear listeners and viewers? Did Atlantis exist? If so, where is it located? Who can we trust? And who should we disregard? If Atlantis doesn't exist at all, what does that say about the people who want to believe it's real? We didn't touch everything that history and folklore have on this subject tonight. So let us know in the comments below if there's something you'd like us to do a follow-up on. In the description below, you can find the sources used for tonight's program. Now, next time, it is going to be time to do our true crime segment of Friday Night Frights. And I am so excited for this because we get to talk about one of those cases that it's so obvious it would be a pick. You have so many books written on it, so many theories and speculations thrown your way about who was Jack the Ripper and what was the purpose of his rampage and why did he kill those poor women and whether or not we've actually figured out who the real killer is. That's what we'll be discussing next time, November 10th, if I actually do things correctly. And stream when I say I'm going to. So with that in mind, see ya.